Good evening. My name is Gregory Drew. I'm a paramedic hybrid program student at Crowder College. This evening I'll be bringing you the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. As you may recall from your EMT basic program, that the synaptic nervous system is part of the nervous system that voluntarily responds to external stimuli, and that the autonomic nervous system is the part of this nervous system that involuntarily regulates internal body functions. Additionally, the autonomic nervous system can be further subdivided into two divisions: the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system regulates body temperature, coordinates cardiovascular, respiratory, digestive, excretory, and reproductive functions. The parasympathetic nervous system is one of two main divisions of the autonomic nervous system. The general function is to control homeostasis and the body's rest and digest response. It is also called the craniosacral division, involving the cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. Our sympathetic nervous system is the second of the two main divisions of the autonomic nervous system. Its general action is to mobilize the body's fight or flight response. It is also called the thoracolumbar division, involving the thoracic nerves 1 through 8. Both of these systems control the same group of body functions, but they have opposite effects on the functions that they regulate. The sympathetic nervous system prepares the body for intense physical activity and is often referred to as the fight or flight response. The parasympathetic nervous system has almost the exact opposite effect and relaxes the body and inhibits or slows many high energy functions. The effects of the parasympathetic nervous system can be summarized by the phrase rest and digest. By the chart you can see here, we have the sympathetic as being the stressed and the parasympathetic as being relaxed. You'll notice that based on where the different nerves are located on the spinal column, where they fall or how they respond. The sympathetic nervous system controls the body's response to a perceived threat and is responsible for the fight or flight, whereas the parasympathetic controls the homeostasis and the body at rest and is responsible for the body's rest and digest function. There's a relationship between the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. The sympathetic has a widespread effect on the visceral organs, whereas the parasympathetic modifies the activity of structures innervated by specific cranial nerves and pelvic nerves. Most vital organs are innervated by both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves, and the two often oppose each other in an antagonistic effect. The subdivisions of the autonomic nervous system. When we talk about the sympathetic division and parasympathetic division, we have under the parasympathetic, all ganglionic fibers release acetylcholine, and these effects are stimulatory, whereas the postganglionic fibers release acetylcholine, but the effects are inhibitory. They can be or will be. In the sympathetic division, all preganglionic fibers release acetylcholine, and the effects are stimulatory, whereas most postganglionic fibers release norepinephrine. The effects are also stimulatory. With homeostasis and the nervous system, homeostasis is like a seesaw in the way that the body responds to stimulus. Homeostasis is defined as a dynamic balance between the autonomic branches. At the rest and digest phase, the parasympathetic activity is dominant, which is the parasympathetic side. During the sympathetic activity, the sympathetic activity dominates the fight or flight response. As you see with the spinal nerves, the motor neurons, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic neurons, we're going to explain this based on the spinal cord controls all the nerve paths. So that's where they're all housed. We have the motor neurons, which then are transitioned into the neuromuscular junction, and we get the nicotinic effect. and acetylcholine is then released. Whereas with the sympathetic, we have the sympathetic effectors, the adrenergic receptors, and norepinephrine is released. With our parasympathetic system, we have the parasympathetic effectors and the muscarinic receptors, which then also releases acetylcholine. By looking at this chart, you'll see how the somatic and the autonomic nervous system deal with the hormones and axons that are released and how they affect the organs. We're going to see the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system and how it connects into the effector organs. When we look at the sympathetic division, we see the acetylcholine is in the central nervous system and it goes through the ganglionic process, the peripheral nervous system. Norepinephrine is then released and it goes to the smooth muscles such as our blood vessels, our intestines. We also look at glands and cardiac muscles. Where with the sympathetic division, we also have it where it goes, acetylcholine is sent to the adrenal medulla, and epinephrine and norepinephrine are then released into the blood vessels, which then go to the smooth muscles and the glands and the cardiac muscles. With our parasympathetic division, we're going to see that the central nervous system has the ganglionic process where it receives the acetylcholine, but then it also releases it as well. The sympathetic nervous system. This is Scott. Scott is a brand new EMT and he's on his first call. His unit's been dispatched to a domestic disturbance where the husband is combative and responding to an unknown drug substance intoxication. Prior to this call, Scott is anxious and waiting to get the chance to drive with the lights and sirens, as well as actually get to do some patient care. Upon arrival, he visually sees the local police officers trying to restrain a very large and agitated man. As you can see in this picture, you'll see the EMTs and the officers trying to take down a very large man. In that moment, Scott's body goes into overdrive. His brain recognizes the threat that's in front of him, and he knows that he has to help. His sympathetic nervous system is activated, and without any conscious control by Scott, the following body functions are affected. In this chart, you're going to see multiple things where it originates, activates, the neuron pathways, general body response, the cardiovascular, pulmonary, musculoskeletal, the pupils, the GI system, and the salivary glands and adrenal glands, as well as the glucose and glycogen conversions and urinary response. In this scenario, Scott's heart rate is increased. An increased heart rate results in an increase in oxygen and nutrients that reach the brain and muscles, preparing them to deal with whatever Scott has to face. The liver is stimulated to release glucose into the bloodstream, providing more energy that will be ready to power the muscles in case it is needed. The bronchioles in the lungs are dilated to allow more air into the lungs, which will increase oxygenation of the blood and keep up with the increased flow of blood through the lungs due to the increased heart rate. The pupils of his eyes will be dilated because the sympathetic nervous system is often activated when people are surprised. Pupil dilation is a visual cue that we use to read surprise on an individual's face. Also, your patients or your opposite can see surprise in your face just by the way your pupils react. The adrenal glands are stimulated to secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine. The adrenal glands are a pair of hormone-producing glands located at the top of the kidney that respond to stress. Together, the epinephrine and norepinephrine secreted by the adrenal glands have the same basic effect as the nerves of the sympathetic nervous system by increasing heart rate, increasing bronchial dilation, and increasing glucose release from the liver. In addition, norepinephrine is also known to increase alertness. It may seem redundant here that these hormones have the same action as the sympathetic neurons, but hormones have longer lasting effects than the nerve impulses. So while the initial fight or flight response is mediated by neurons, these hormones serve to reinforce and help sustain the response. Another problem that Scott has to consider is the fact that the digestive activity is inhibited. In the moment of truth, a person may need every last ounce of energy they can muster. If Scott makes it through the ordeal, then he'll have plenty of time to complete the digestion of whatever he ate for breakfast. Scott's bladder is relaxed. After all, this isn't the time for a person to relieve themselves. There are more pressing matters at hand. Even so, I bet that some of you were told that people wet themselves when they get scared. You've heard the saying, "I peed my pants." It turns out that the sympathetic nervous system is only activated in situations where the brain decides that there is a reasonable chance of survival. In very extreme cases of danger where the chances of survival are remote, crippling fear often takes over and people can lose their bladder and bowel control. They may also go limp and play dead or faint as a last-ditch effort for survival. This is not the complete list of all the functions regulated by the sympathetic nervous system, but it does include the major functions that would come into play in Scott's situation with this patient. So, in a panic, Scott turns to his partner and he admits he's scared. He stood there considering the idea that he was in the wrong field. In his mind, he ran back to the station on foot, but it was mostly a thought based on Scott's sympathetic nervous system preparing his body for the threat that was before it. Now we're going to talk about the parasympathetic nervous system. As we went along, Scott sees the police officers and his partner moving in to restrain the patient. He goes right in and follows his partner's instruction like any good EMT should. After the patient is restrained and calmed by the excellent work of his awesome paramedic, and maybe some assistance from some Haldol or Versed or whatever our medical control says, this patient can be restrained and calmed, and Scott feels his body relax. The feeling of stress leaves his body. The situation is contained and controlled, and now it's time to just get to work taking care of the patient. His parasympathetic nervous system begins the process of relaxing and calming itself so that it can recover from the heightened physical and metabolic activity it experienced. As you can see by this chart, you're going to see the same functions, originations, and the activates of response neurons, our system's responses, and where there are no involvement with the adrenal glands or also with the glycogen to glucose conversion. In this case, Scott's heart rate is decreased. With the danger behind him, Scott no longer needs increased blood supply to his muscles, so his heart can slow down and conserve energy. The liver stops releasing glucose into the blood and instead focuses its activity on producing bile and detoxifying dangerous substances. His bronchioles in his lungs are constricted to allow less air into the lungs. Now that the heart rate is decreased and the oxygen consumption in the muscles will be lower, the body doesn't need as much oxygen. The pupils of the eyes constrict back to a more normal size. The adrenal glands stop secreting epinephrine and norepinephrine. Now that the danger is past, it's time for the body to relax and recover. And these two hormones are counterproductive to resting and relaxation. Digestive activity is stimulated. So since Scott and his crew survived the ordeal, his body can now continue digesting his breakfast. He'll need the energy to replace some of the reserves he used during the encounter with the out-of-control patient. Restraining a patient takes a lot out of you. For those of you that have actually taken a patient down, you know we kind of feel wasted at the end of it. It's just like when we're on a call and you're going pretty fast, lights and siren, you get there, your heart's racing, you start all this work, and then once the call is over, you just breathe. Also, Scott's bladder contracts. Without an immediate threat around, Scott may now feel to relieve himself for the full bladder. The one thing to consider is lay off the big gulps and a lot of the coffee, because situations like this previous one, we really don't have a bathroom right around, and when you've got to go, you know you have to go. So again, this is not a complete list, but this gives you an idea of what we're discussing with the regulatory and systematic effects. So now I'm going to go into summary. We know that there are two main divisions of the autonomic nervous system. We have the sympathetic nervous system, which prepares the body for intense physical activity and is often referred to as the fight or flight response. Our parasympathetic system has the exact opposite effect and relaxes the body and inhibits or slows many high energy functions. It's pretty much a rest and digest response. When immediate threat is present, the functions of the sympathetic nervous system prepare the body for the extreme physical activity and include increased heart rate, glucose release from the liver, bronchial dilation, pupil dilation, secretion of epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal glands, and relaxation of the bladder and inhibition of digestive activity. Once the threat is contained or gone, the function of the parasympathetic nervous system promote relaxation and recovery of the body and include decreased heart rate, bile production in the liver, bronchial contraction, pupil contraction, inhibition of the adrenal glands, contractions of the body, and stimulation of digestive activity. And thus, at the end of it, now the crew gets to rest. So, if there are any questions, please feel free to email. Have a great day.